The war that has engulfed Iran is no longer being viewed simply as a regional military confrontation. It is now being felt as a full-spectrum geopolitical emergency with consequences for shipping, inflation, energy security, diplomacy, and the wider global economy. What began with U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran on February 28 has, in just a matter of weeks, turned into a confrontation that is rattling markets from Washington to Brussels to Tokyo. At the center of that fallout is one narrow strip of water, the Strait of Hormuz. That choke point has long been one of the most sensitive arteries in the global energy system. The U.S. Energy Information Administration has described it as a critical transit route for oil, and its strategic significance has only become clearer as this conflict has escalated. With attacks on tankers, energy infrastructure, and maritime routes intensifying, the world is now staring at the possibility that even a limited military crisis can trigger a much wider economic shock. The immediate anxiety is about supply. Oil traders, shipping companies, policymakers, and central banks are all asking the same question. How much disruption can the global economy absorb if the flow of crude and liquefied natural gas through the Gulf remains constrained? That fear has already shown up in prices. Reuters reported that Brent crude surged as high as $119 a barrel before easing, while gas prices in Europe jumped sharply as the market tried to absorb the scale of the damage to Gulf energy infrastructure. Inside Washington, that pressure is now driving policy discussions that would have seemed politically implausible only a short time ago. The United States is actively weighing whether to ease sanctions on Iranian oil that is already loaded on tankers and stranded at sea. Reuters reported that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said the administration is considering lifting sanctions on about 140 million barrels of Iranian oil already floating offshore in a move designed not to strengthen Tehran, but to inject emergency supply into a market suddenly starved of confidence and volume. That possibility reveals the unusual bind Washington now faces. On one hand, the United States is confronting Iran militarily and diplomatically. On the other, it is being forced to reckon with the global price shock that comes when war collides with the energy system. The administration appears to be searching for a narrow path between those two realities, sustain pressure on Iran, but prevent the war from detonating a broader inflation crisis. That balancing act is visible in the language coming from U.S. officials. In discussing the market fallout, Scott Bessent said the U.S. may lift sanctions on approximately 140 million barrels of Iranian oil currently stranded at sea. Reuters reported that the proposal being explored would resemble a temporary waiver structure already used in a separate recent move involving Russian oil. The idea is not a wholesale reversal of sanctions policy, but a limited emergency release valve aimed at calming markets at a moment of acute volatility. The administration is also considering additional use of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. U.S. stock data published by the Energy Information Administration show that the reserve remains a major emergency tool in Washington's arsenal, even after years of politically contentious drawdowns and replenishment efforts. In a crisis where every signal matters, the mere possibility of further spur action is intended to tell traders that the United States is prepared to intervene if supply tightens further. Still, there is no illusion in policy circles that these steps would fully solve the underlying problem. Global oil demand remains immense, and even a one-off release of stranded Iranian crude would offer only limited relief relative to the size of the market. What it might do, however, is buy time for diplomacy, time for military deterrence, and time for a broader coalition response aimed at restoring shipping security. That is why the current debate is not just about barrels, it is about leverage. The United States appears to be using energy policy as one part of a much wider geopolitical strategy, one that seeks to mobilize allies and major energy consumers around a common interest in reopening the strait and deterring further attacks on maritime infrastructure. Reuters reported that Britain, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Japan, and Canada issued a joint statement condemning attacks on commercial vessels and civilian infrastructure and demanding that the Strait of Hormuz be reopened. That allied posture matters because this crisis is landing unevenly across the global economy. The United States is vulnerable to higher gasoline and diesel costs, but Europe and Asia are in many ways even more exposed. Europe remains highly sensitive to gas price spikes, especially after years of restructuring its energy system following the loss of much Russian pipeline supply. Asia, meanwhile, depends heavily on Gulf crude and Leng flows. If those flows remain impaired, the economic pain will not be distributed evenly. It will hit import-dependent economies hardest. The latest shock came from Qatar. Reuters reported that Iranian attacks damaged the country's gas infrastructure badly enough to wipe out around 17% of Qatar's Leng export capacity for years, not weeks. That is a staggering figure in a market already stretched by geopolitical uncertainty. Another Reuters report said European gas prices surged by as much as 35% as traders digested the scale of the disruption. That is why European leaders are speaking about the conflict in language that goes beyond solidarity or diplomacy. For them, this is about physical energy security and price stability. The fear is not only of expensive fuel, but of a renewed inflation cycle that would drag central banks back into crisis mode. Reuters noted that market participants are already reassessing growth and inflation expectations because of the war's impact on energy infrastructure and trade routes. Germany's Federal Minister for Economic Affairs and Energy, Katharina Reike, has emerged as one of the European voices urging caution over any move that could legitimize Iranian oil sales under present conditions. Her position reflects a broader European dilemma. Governments want lower prices and safer shipping lanes, but they do not want to appear to reward military escalation. That tension is likely to define the next phase of Western diplomacy. In Washington, the response is extending beyond sanctions and reserves. Reuters reported that the United States has issued a 60-day Jones Act waiver allowing foreign-flagged vessels to carry fuel and fertilizer between U.S. ports. That is a striking move politically and symbolically. It underscores how seriously the administration is taking the logistical and inflationary consequences of the Gulf crisis. The aim is straightforward: widen domestic shipping options, reduce bottlenecks, and blunt some of the secondary effects of disrupted global energy flows. But measures like these remain tactical, not transformational. They can soften some of the near-term pressure. They cannot eliminate the strategic vulnerability that has now been exposed so dramatically. The real problem is that the world still depends heavily on a handful of maritime choke points, and none is more consequential than Hormuz. That has prompted a wave of new thinking about alternatives. One idea attracting attention is the proposal to bypass the Strait of Hormuz altogether by constructing a canal through Oman's Musandam Peninsula. On the surface, it has the appeal of a grand strategic fix: engineer a new shipping route, reduce reliance on an exposed passage, and permanently lower the geopolitical risk premium attached to Gulf energy exports. But once the proposal is examined more closely, its obstacles become overwhelming. The Musandam Peninsula is not an easy landscape for canal building. It is rugged, mountainous, and geologically unforgiving, with dramatic elevation changes and hard rock formations. Cutting a deep, wide shipping corridor through that terrain would be an engineering project of extraordinary difficulty. It would not be comparable to routine dredging. It would be more like remaking a piece of the region's physical geography. The financial cost would also be immense. Even major canal expansions in friendlier terrain have required billions of dollars and years of planning. A Musandam Canal, built to handle modern supertankers and lung carriers, could climb into the tens or even hundreds of billions, depending on the design, security architecture, and associated infrastructure. That level of spending would require not just money, but an unusual degree of international political coordination and long-term strategic trust. And even then, the canal would not remove the core vulnerability. It would merely relocate it. A man-made passage would itself become a strategic target, vulnerable to sabotage, missile attacks, cyber disruption, mining, or blockade. In other words, the world would still be dependent on a narrow passage through a volatile region. The map would change, but the underlying fragility would remain. That is why many officials and analysts continue to focus less on bypassing Hormuz than on reopening and securing it. The White House has signaled that military planning is underway, even if details remain deliberately vague. In a recent briefing, Caroline Leavitt said the United States military has a lot of capabilities, as you have seen play out over the last 18 days, and they still do have tricks up their sleeve. She added, rest assured there is a plan. They're working on it. Those remarks were meant to project confidence without telegraphing operational details. That same message is being echoed through NATO channels, though in more measured language. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, who remains at the center of alliance diplomacy in 2026, has been in active consultations with allies on the crisis. In comments reflecting that effort, Mark Rutte said, "We all agree, of course, that Strait has to open up again. The significance of that line is not just rhetorical, It suggests that Western governments increasingly view freedom of navigation in Hormuz not simply as a regional concern, but as a collective strategic priority. And yet reopening the strait is easier said than done. Military operations in such a confined and heavily surveilled environment carry major escalation risks. Any effort to neutralize mines, escort tankers, deter drone attacks, or strike launch sites would involve decisions with consequences far beyond maritime security. That is especially true if Iran interprets those moves as steps toward a broader campaign against its state infrastructure. The danger, then, is not merely prolonged disruption. It is escalation by increments. First comes the attack on infrastructure, then the shipping slowdown, then emergency market interventions, then coalition naval planning, then perhaps direct confrontations at sea. At each stage, the logic of crisis management pushes governments toward greater involvement, even as each additional move raises the stakes. That is part of what makes this moment so consequential. Markets are not just responding to lost cargoes or damaged facilities. They are trying to price a geopolitical trajectory whose endpoint remains unknown. Traders, insurers, shipping firms, and central banks are all making judgments under extreme uncertainty. Will the damage be contained, or is this the beginning of a longer energy conflict in the Gulf? So far, the market's answer has been volatile rather than definitive. Reuters reported that oil prices pulled back from their highs after diplomatic signals from Washington, but that retreat has not erased the wider fear in financial markets. The concern is that futures prices may be understating the duration or depth of the disruption. That concern is amplified by the fact that once critical energy infrastructure is damaged, recovery is often slow, costly, and uncertain. There is also the China question. Much of the Iranian oil now under discussion was originally headed toward China, which remains a major buyer of sanctioned and discounted crude. Any U.S. decision to allow those barrels to move more freely would have implications not only for markets, but for diplomacy with Beijing. That is one reason some analysts believe the sanctions debate is about more than price relief. It may also be part of a larger attempt to build pressure on Iran through a broader alignment of interests among major consuming powers. Whether that strategy works is another matter. Critics argue that easing sanctions, even temporarily, risks undercutting the very pressure campaign Washington claims to be pursuing. Supporters counter that emergency flexibility in a market crisis is not the same as strategic capitulation. Both sides understand the optics are fraught. The disagreement is over whether the economic risk of doing nothing is even worse. For ordinary consumers, the debate is far simpler. They experience this war through prices at the gas station, in shipping costs, in airline fares, in food inflation, in utility bills, and eventually in interest rates. That is what turns a distant military confrontation into a political problem at home. The further energy prices climb, the more likely it becomes that governments will be judged not only on their foreign policy choices, but on their ability to shield households from the fallout. That is why the current crisis cannot be reduced to a military map of strikes and retaliation. It is also a battle over economic endurance. Iran is trying to demonstrate that pressure on its territory can be answered with pressure on the global energy system. The United States and its allies, meanwhile, are trying to show that coercion in the Gulf can be contained without ceding strategic ground. The result is a contest in which oil tankers, lane trains, shipping laws, sanctions waivers, and reserve releases all become instruments of statecraft. For now, the world remains in the dangerous middle of that contest. Hormuz is still indispensable. Energy infrastructure across the Gulf remains exposed. Markets are still searching for a floor, and policymakers are still improvising under pressure. The choices now being weighed in Washington, Brussels, and allied capitals are not just about immediate price relief. They are about how much risk the world is willing to absorb and how far governments are prepared to go to preserve the flow of energy through one of the most contested corridors on Earth. What is already clear is that this is no longer a story about one battlefield. It is a story about the collision between war and interdependence. The fighting may be centered on Iran and its neighbors, but the consequences radiate outward through every economy tied to fuel, freight, inflation, and trade. That is why even seemingly technical decisions, from sanctions waivers to shipping exemptions, now carry strategic weight. And that is also why the next move matters so much. If maritime security improves and energy flows normalize, the current spike may become a severe but temporary shock. But if the strait remains contested, if infrastructure attacks continue, or if coalition intervention deepens the conflict, then what the world is now experiencing as a market panic could harden into something much more serious, a prolonged global energy crisis with recessionary consequences. In that sense, the real significance of this moment lies not only in the price of oil, but in what that price now represents. It reflects the fragility of a global system still built around narrow corridors, concentrated infrastructure, and political fault lines that can ignite without warning. And it is a reminder that in the modern world, a war in one region can very quickly become an economic emergency for everyone.